Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gary Marr. I'm the President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. I am delighted to have all of our distinguished guests here today, both on stage and on the floor. And I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I know it's been a long day. We started at roughly 9 o'clock this morning. But let me promise you, this might be the very best panel of the day. We've got a great group of guests here up front. We did some phone calls earlier in the month to talk about our discussion on this subject that we're going to broach today. I told the High Commissioner from Australia he only had 2 minutes to talk about Australian cricket and its supremacy, so he'll stick to that. And with the Japanese ambassador, he and I have been negotiating Shohei Ohtani coming to the Toronto Blue Jays. So let me say that this is an opportunity for us to really gain an insight what our partners are thinking in the region. It's our ability to look at what Canada's key partners in the Indo-Pacific region think of the Canadian engagement and the strategy, where we may be doing well, where we may needing to make some progress, and looking at both near-term and longer-term issues. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Sometimes there's a reluctance of people to come to a microphone and ask a question. So write this number down. It's 587-897-3311, and that's my business phone here. I carry two phones because one is my business number that everybody has, and then the other number is the one that only my 96-year-old mother has. And so when my business phone rings, I may or may not answer it, but when my mother phones, she's 4'10", she's the only person in the world that I'm scared of, so I always answer that phone. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to text them to me, but I'm going to throw out this opening question, and it's about, there's sort of 5 pillars to the Indo-Pacific strategy that the federal government's laid out. Number 1, promoting peace, resilience, and security. Number 2, expanding trade, investment, and supply chain resilience. Number 3, investing in connecting people. 4, building a sustainable and green future. And 5, Canada as an active and engaged partner to the Indo-Pacific. And so my opening question for our ambassadors here, and I should have introduced them. I'm sorry if I didn't, but it's in your program. Yamanouchi-san, Ambassador of Japan. I'm sorry, Maria, Ambassador for the Philippines. Ambassador Lim from Korea, and then High Commissioner Ryan from Australia. So here's my opening question. Tell us, and you can answer in any order, what did the government of Canada get right in the strategy, and what did it miss in the Indo-Pacific strategy?
If I may, answering to that question, I think that is a very appropriate question, but I would like to take three key words to describe this Indo-Pacific strategy. First, the reality. Second, commitment. Third, collaboration. Reality, that is the reality of the 21st century. We see geopolitical difficulties, Ukraine attempts to change status quo by using force. And also another reality of 21st century is global warming. What Guterres said, global boiling. So these realities, very serious matters. Canada is a country which has ability and willingness to contribute to the betterment of the world in this very difficult 21st century reality. That is the one thing. The second, commitment by Canadian government and Canadian companies and people to address the Indo-Pacific strategy. That is a clear commitment and should be welcomed by all the Asian countries, because Canada, historically and geographically, it's closer to Europe and Atlantic Ocean. Asia is far away from this Ottawa, and Pacific Ocean is much wider than the Atlantic Ocean. But still, this Canada showing its commitment to Indo-Pacific And also, this strategy is full of the commitment. So we really want to see this commitment be fulfilled by in action. That is a very important thing. Third, collaboration. I'm the ambassador from Japan, so I would like to mention the actual collaboration going on between Japan and Canada. We have action plan to realize six areas, which is very much coincide with the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy. I will tell you two very specific examples. One is commitment by the Canadian Navy. They sent 3 frigates. That is amazing commitment, given this limited number of frigates which Canadian Navy has. And also, this actual military asset is second to the United States in that region. That is a huge commitment. And second one, just a couple of weeks ago, Minister In led Team Canada. That is a big business delegation, 250 Canadian people from 160 Canadian companies coming to Japan. They're having the big meetings and separate meetings. That is a clear testimony for the beginning of the new page of Japan-Canada business relations. Thank you.
Thank you. Down here?
Thank you, Gary, and thank you for having us here to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy in Canada West. I consider this a very valuable opportunity for the Philippines and ASEAN to have a voice in discussing a strategy that impacts our region. I've been here since this morning, and one thing that struck me was, in true Canadian humble fashion, the notion that Canada is not a player in the region. This has been discussed several times. But I do remember, as a very young officer in the service, I did attend a workshop series funded by SIDA called Managing Potential Conflicts in the South China Sea. Emphasis on potential. At the time we were doing the workshop series, reefs were reefs. There were no military installations in the area. Can you imagine what would have happened if Canada stayed? So Canada has been a player in the region, but I think the most important part will be the pillar that says active and engaged. And I would say, to that I would add consistent.
Very good. Ambassador Lim, any comments?
Thank you so much for having me today. And since this is sort of the opening remarks, if you don't mind, I want to just give you a very, very brief background about what happened throughout the last year. Seoul had released our own Indo-Pacific strategy last December, and just 1 month after the Canada did. And even before the release of our Indo-Pacific strategy, Seoul and Ottawa, those Indo-Pacific strategy had been on the top of the agenda, meaning that we had a full prior consultation on the Indo-Pacific strategies between our two capitals. So when we released our Indo-Pacific strategies, Minister Jolie, she commented that our approaches are very much aligned and complementary, and is going to drive forward our shared priorities. So some high-ranking Korean government officials, they liken our Indo-Pacific strategies twins. So as a twin brother in the Indo-Pacific strategy, that I cannot be very much critical about your strategy. And Korea and Canada, we were the last countries that joined a group of other like-minded countries that had already released their own Indo-Pacific strategies. But the timing of Canada's rolling out this strategy was very timely, because we had a new government in Seoul in May last year, and in the past, the Korean government, there was a time Korean government had sort of the reservation about even using the term of Indo-Pacific. So when we were working on like the joint document in the United States, the Washington, they preferred to use Indo-Pacific, while we were insisting on the use of Asia-Pacific. But with the new government in Seoul, and just with the release of the Indo-Pacific strategies in Canada, we could bolster we could start the new chapter in our relationship by using same languages and same platforms, and it really means a lot in our bilateral relationship. And as Canada has 5 pillars in the Indo-Pacific strategy, we have 9 priority areas. And this year, our embassy had made a table comprising all the key elements of our strategies and Canadian strategies. And I was really amazed by so many commonalities between the two. And we were able to identify more than a dozen common items that we can work together in the future. And about your last questions, if you compare the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategies with others, maybe some wordings and some items may be missing, but this is sort of the guideline, and lacking of the certain wording and certain items does not mean Canada is not ready to do work on that item. But since this list is not exhaustive, it's just indicative, I think the Canadian strategy is quite broad and comprehensive, and it can be a very good starting point to work together with us. Okay, thank you.
I like this. This is a starting point. High Commissioner Scott Ryan.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks for pulling this together. I don't know if I would go as far as to say hits and misses. It's not really appropriate for another country to say that. What I'd say is that the Indo-Pacific strategy that Canada released a year ago reflects similar views that we in Australia have held. This is a region under more geostrategic pressure than it has been in decades. It's got some of the greatest strategic challenges it's had in decades. And Australia welcomes countries that see their role as being to stand by the international norms and the rules that both ensure prosperity and prevent conflict. Canada has had, in many ways, a unique role in the formation and propagation of those rules globally. So the Indo-Pacific strategy that Canada has released recognises that the Indo-Pacific is a region with that pressure, and Canada wants to be a voice to maintain that particular order and to defend it. And when I look at the pillars of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, they are areas that Australia and Canada works on together. You know, whether that be particularly at the moment, we have a lot in common as trading economies. We have a lot in common as resource suppliers, which is changing and evolving as the energy transition drives a change in that particular industry sector, just to name one. So I think that the Indo-Pacific strategy is a reflection that Canada shares the values and aspirations that many of us do to defend and propagate the international order in our region.
Very good. I'm on Vashi Kapelas' show, Power Play, once a week, and I've tried to learn from her how to ask a good question. But here's the thing that I do that she doesn't do. She doesn't ask her viewing audience for questions. So again, my number, 587-897-3311. And here's a question that's come through. Your views, I'd like to know your views on how other Canadian stakeholders, businesses, academic, civil society are engaging in the Indo-Pacific. What sectors are a good place to start, and where should we really focus on as to begin with? Anybody like to take that? Scott?
I'll kick it off from this end. I think Kanji made the point earlier that Canada's a big place. I make the joke that it's one of the few places in the world Australians come and go, wow, it's bigger. And so Kanji made the point that, there is the historic link south and east, and Vancouver is a long way from here, and Asia is a long way. So that's one challenge about trying to get a geographically diverse country to look west, with all the opportunities it provides, with all the competing opportunities that Canada's location has provided it with historically and continues to provide it with. One of the differences I say between Australia and Canada, and this is relevant to looking at the Indo-Pacific, is we are simply defined by geography. We are at the apex of the Indo-Pacific. We are between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Canada is defined in many ways by its proximity historically to other places. Now, I notice as I head further west, that historic link to Asia, Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific gets stronger simply by virtue of geography. Economic links, student links, business links, they are different in parts of Canada just as they are different in parts of the United States, Europe and Australia. So I think the places to look for are the places where there is a necessary or there is an appetite for increasing opportunity. And that particularly applies in resources, particularly applies in agriculture, particularly applies in education and professional services, all things that have underpinned, I would suggest, Australia's great engagement with the region over the last 3 or 4 decades.
I mean, at our opening this morning, opening comments were provided by the chairman of Canada West Foundation, former Senator Doug Black, and he pointed out that, Maria, I think you were here, that 71% of the exports that go to the Indo-Pacific region come from the 4 western provinces, British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So I think that's the point that you're making, Scott, that's a good place to start. Ambassador Yamanouchi.
Yes, your question is which sector is most suitable for the discussion for this in terms of the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy. So I would say critical mineral is a very, very important sector which we need to talk. Because given that this geopolitics and given this global warming, the Canada's critical mineral can play very, very important, significant role to address this reality of 21st century. Then the question is how we could develop these critical minerals. Honestly, great potentials, but at the same time, we see clear challenges. In order to develop these critical minerals in terms of the businesses, we have to have the infrastructure. We have to have the very streamlined regulations and procedures. And we have to have the clear understanding and support from indigenous people. And fourth, we have to have the close coordination between federal government and provincial government. So these 4 challenges are never easy, but I think that can be addressed. Then the Canadian potential of critical minerals, all those supply chain of the electric vehicles and others, be very, very significant. And that is a clear fulfillment of the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy that includes all those global warming and other things. Thank you.
Very good. Ambassador Lim.
Canada has so many things to offer in the Pacific region, and if you see the 5 pillars of the partnership in your Indo-Pacific strategies, I believe that 2 partnerships really stand out. The first one is the partnership for security and the rule-based international order. And also our strategy will put emphasis on fostering the rule-based international order and human rights. And in the past, the Korean government's approach to Southeast Asia and South Asia was very much economic cooperation centered. But this time we have introduced the partnership in fostering the rule-based international order and very much value-driven foreign policy into the blueprint for our future foreign policy. And Canada is in a very good position to foster, to take the leading role in fostering rule-based international rules, as Canada has built a very good image as a country of very fair and impartial actor in the international stage. And the another partnership that Canada really make added value in the sphere of Indo-Pacific is, as Ambassador Yamanouchi Kanji said, the partnership for the global supply chain resiliency. And I was very happy to see Korea and Canada working together very closely on this issue. So we are able to launch 2+2 high-level dialogue on economic security involving the foreign ministers and industry ministers. And that was the first ever that kind of forum, not only Korea but also Canada have had. And also we have signed the MOU on critical minerals. And as you know, so many Korean companies now, five Korean companies, they are making huge investment in the field of the electric vehicle batteries and electric vehicle battery components. So the business community and the government, we are looking to Canada as an ideal partner to address the issue of the global supply chain resiliency. Okay, thank you.
Ambassador Maria.
Thank you, Gary. Indeed, we have noticed an uptick in interest following the announcement of the strategy at the federal level. We have had an unprecedented number of high-level visits to the Philippines. On the provincial level, we've had several premiers come to visit the Philippines. But, and the big but is, there are 1 million Filipino Canadians living in Canada. And I guess we have made such a good impression that most of the provincial governments who come to the Philippines come with the aim of recruiting more workers. But I wish they would explore the other dimensions of the cooperation. For example, we are the 4th largest nickel producing country in the world. We are also in a demographic sweet spot, meaning majority of our workers are of working age, in their productive years. So there are many other areas of cooperation between the Philippines and Canada that have not been explored.
I think that's a really terrific point. Just on the subject of young people and having the right demographics, this is an interesting question that comes from one of you. There's a lot of young leaders in the room. What role can young people play in advancing collaboration and connection with the Indo-Pacific? And what advice would any of you have for young leaders that are in the room today?
I was a young student many years ago. And I really think the important thing is to go the spot, the ground. Seeing is believing. So hypothetical thinking is good things, but at the same time, meeting people, visiting all those, every corner of the world to feel the earth and meeting people, that would enhance your ideas and the collaboration and the communication.
Others? Ambassador Maria.
Many, many years ago, I was told that success is consistency to purpose. So I would advise, especially the young leaders, to be consistent and to continue doing what you're doing now. Otherwise, you cannot be doing one thing now, then something happens in another region, be distracted. We all have limited bandwidth, limited by resources, limited by manpower. But if the Indo-Pacific strategy were to succeed, it would have to be done consistently. Somebody would have to be there to show up and to continue putting the resources behind it. And the young people are in perfect position to do that.
So this is the second time you've gone on the theme of consistency. So my follow-up question for you is, has the Canadian government been consistent in its engagement in the region, in your view?
The Canadian government has been engaged in the region, but there are times when they were more present than others. For example, I think it was Jeff who mentioned about SIDA. There are so many good things that SIDA has done, but because of, I'm not sure if it's bureaucratic, if it's institutional, but I think the SIDA brand, helped open doors and helped flex Canada's soft power. Without the SIDA brand, Canada is not as visible as it should be. Then the other point I want to make on that issue is on the issue of development cooperation, is Canada has consistently been supporting many development cooperation efforts in the region. But there is a propensity to work directly with the non-government institutions or the local governments without coordinating with national governments. In that way, the visibility, the influence, and the impact of the projects are somehow diluted. So one advice also would be to work actively, proactively with the national governments.
Thank you. High Commissioner or Ambassador Lim?
I was just going to say, in response to the previous question, become a voice for its complexity and diversity. The region is is different to the way we've historically described other regions of the world when we've had strategic outlooks. Very different stages of economic development, very different stages of security development, very different and diverse stages of social development. And I think, as well as travel, which I think is always the opportunity, particularly the opportunity to study, and one of the more successful plans Australia had was an outbound scholarship plan that was instituted and been supported by both governments over the last decade, because study and work and living somewhere can give you a degree of understanding that a shorter trip can't. But any travel, particularly around parts of the region, to appreciate its diversity and complexity and becoming a voice for that in our home communities, I think, is particularly important.
Ambassador Lim?
Well, my advice on young Canadians is to explore the region, and to gaining the first-hand knowledge about the region is really, really critical in developing their maybe future career. And without engaging young people, any project we are launching cannot be sustainable. And with the help of Canadian government, we are able to triple the quotas of the working holiday program from 4,000 to 12,000 starting next year. But when we had a quota of 4,000, sometimes on the Canadian side, the applicants for the program was just less than 100, while from Korea there are more than 10,000 applicants for the working holiday program. And when I reach out to the young Canadian students, I found that even though they are very much passionate about learning Korea, K-culture, K-pop, K-drama, but sometimes their knowledge about it very much limited. So I really want to encourage them to go to the region.
There's an old Chinese saying that my father gave to me. In Chinese, it's Hangman Li Lu, Okman Gensi, which means a complete education is to read 10,000 books and walk 10,000 miles. So I think there's a consistency here that that young people should be traveling, and I think that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a visit is worth 1,000 pictures. Let's look at this. What are the other opportunities for Canadian engagement? I mean, we've talked about some of the areas. Maria, you mentioned some areas where the Canadian government has been engaged, but what are the areas that they're not engaged in, that they should be engaged in? Anybody? Ambassador Lim.
Well, I don't have any complaint about the engagement at the level of government, and also the think tanks and civil societies. But maybe the most challenging part in carrying out my duty here in Ottawa is the first one is there is no presence of Canadian media in Seoul, and also in the presence of Korean media here in Ottawa. And when we have a very, very well successful event, but there was no coverage in the press in Seoul. And the first thing the government officials do is they usually see the media clippings, the news clippings, not cables from the other embassies. So we are not in a position to encourage the media and the broadcasting and news outlets to open their office and have correspondence in Seoul. But that is really critical in raising the profile of our relationship. And the another one is in Korea, the role of the National Assembly is very instrumental. And I don't know, maybe you have a different system. You have the parliamentary system and you have a presidential system, and under the check and balance, without engaging our National Assembly on a certain issue, there is clearly a limit to what the governments can do. And how to engage the Canadian Parliament, like the delegations of the Senate and the House regularly visiting Seoul, that is another big task in the bolstering our bilateral relationship.
Thank you. Yamanouchi-san.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Media plays a key role. But in terms of this Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy, and one thing I really want to see there happening in Canada is defense update. And this is very, very important. If you know that Japan is a peace-loving country, but Prime Minister Kishida made a huge decision to double our defense spending in 5 years. That is a tough decision, but Japanese people support it. Why? Because we just realize the severeness of geopolitics surrounding us and in the part of the world. And this geopolitical reality is very, very serious. But Canada is a very blessed country. But I know that all those policy makers and thinkers, some of them really think this defense update is urgent matter. And I really want to see the development of this defense update. I know this is politically sensitive, but from the outside view, now the world, it could be very, very dangerous. And Canada can play a bigger role for that.
So this was a subject matter early this morning when Major General Greg Smith was talking about the security issues in the region. And so, you know, we've seen Admiral Topshee here in Canada talk about the real needs for the Canadian Navy. And then General Smith was saying, well, Canada spent three frigates to go to the region. The U.S. Navy is involved there. I mean, the Chinese Navy is now larger than the U.S. Navy, perhaps not as capable, but the U.S. Navy is deployed all over the world, and the Chinese Navy is located in the East China and South China Seas. I don't know, Scott, is there anything you'd want to comment on the security issue in the region?
Well, it goes to what I said earlier, that we are explicit in that we think the region is at the greatest risk. For decades, it's under more geopolitical pressure, geostrategic pressure. There's pressure on the rules and norms where disagreement does not turn into conflict. What I would say is that with respect to things like defence funding, you know, the Minister for Defence made a speech recently. I was there in Halifax where he talked about the ongoing reinvestment program and referred to the update coming. There was the announcement last week where the Defence Minister and Procurement Minister, amongst others, talked about acquiring a particular capability through the Boeing Poseidon, and that focused on, in the Minister's comments, it talked about interoperability and working with friends, partners and allies. So I think that's an important reflection of the fact that just as more voices and more presence in the region for defending the norms that have seen it become prosperous, that are under much more challenge now than they have been for decades, more resources directed towards that are always welcome as well. Maria?
I'd like to go back to a point that you and Ambassador Lim made about the youth and traveling. In the first 6 months of this year alone, 23,000 Filipino students came as students to Canada. But the number of Canadian students coming to the Philippines, I don't think even reached 100.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I think part of that is that there's not enough information on opportunities for Canadian students to come to Manila under Canadian government scholarships. So that's one area that the Canadian government may want to revisit. The other issue about travel and students is the travel advisories. There has been a long-standing travel advisory on certain sections of the Philippines. And the area in the Philippines under the travel advisory is the area which needs investments and tourism most. So it may be also an opportune time to revisit the travel advisories. And if there are deficiencies or issues, perhaps that should be an area for cooperation. Perhaps we can cooperate with RCMP or the Defense Ministry on how to address whatever concerns there may be in that area in order to have the travel advisories lifted, modified, or whatever's appropriate.
Let me go to an audience question here. What would your countries expect from Canada under the CPTPP?
Well, when Canada takes over as chair, Australia takes over as deputy chair. I think it goes from New Zealand. I'm looking at my staff this year when Canada were deputy chair. And look, trade and that particular agreement's a very important underpinning for the region. It's very important to both our economies. And I think that, quite frankly, the procedures and discussions within that group have shown to be quite productive since it was initiated, ratified and implemented. And it's not like we'd want to see something, to be honest. Everything I've seen in the lead up to it shows that will continue under the Canadian chair this coming year.
Ambassador?
Actually, I have been heavily involved with this TPP development. I was economic minister in Washington, D.C. when the agreement was reached in Georgia. And I was assistant minister headquarters for economic affairs, standing up the parliament to answering the question to all those tough questions from the opposition party. And I did twice. Then TPP is not just a trade agreement. TPP is a great testimony of our huge strategy to create free and open Indo-Pacific. So Canada is a very, very indispensable part of it. And now, TPP, we have a new member, UK. Then we have to think hard how to make TPP to address these difficulties in the world, and how to make TPP utilize to create free and open Indo-Pacific. Next year, just Scott said, Canada is becoming a chair country of TPP. And this is a time for us to think hard to utilize this TPP to fulfill our vision of free and open Indo-Pacific.
So in part, you've answered the next question, which also comes from the floor. Canada works with each of your countries to advance gender equality, human rights, and peace, both in the Indo-Pacific and internationally. However, when we talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy, these areas of collaboration often don't get recognized because they're not as specific as numbers and investments. So the question is, are soft power or soft diplomacy actions like this valued by your countries, and is Canada viewed as a partner of choice for your countries in advancing those areas?
Well, I wouldn't say they're not valued as much. I mean, what I read in the media and what people talk about isn't necessarily always a reflection of the work that's undertaken. You know, last year, not technically part of this, but IPEDCA was launched with Australia, New Zealand, Canada and Taiwan. Our governments talk a great deal about everything from the energy transition, climate change, managing the economic transition that involves, to a substantial First Nations, Indigenous peoples agenda. And that is something that Canada particularly is quite forward-leaning and is well known internationally for. I don't think just because we don't read about them doesn't mean the work's not being done. But there are elements of the Indo-Pacific strategy that go to what we have been discussing, which are the more challenging parts. But to go to what Kanji said, whether it's the CPTPP or whether it's in other areas where we work together, they all help underpin a free, open, we forget it's also prosperous Indo-Pacific, as most of our countries have the objective for, to maintain and continue the enormous economic development that has taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in that region over the last few decades.
Yamanouchi-san.
Yes, I personally love Canadian music a lot. So I feel soft power of Canada is big enough. But I'm going to answer the question of the impression or perception of Canada, which is not just image. I think those perception of the Japanese people is based upon the actual actions and things. So I'll give you one good example. Last May in Hiroshima, G7 leaders meeting was held. You know the connotation of Hiroshima, bomb and town of peace. And Prime Minister Trudeau is the only Prime Minister, G7 leader, who visited Peace Memorial Park twice. His action is a testimony of his commitment to the nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. And the Japanese people knows it. So I think the Canada's image or impression is based upon the actual action. by citizens or by leaders, not just the words, the action. I think that is very, very clear things. And the Japanese people remember very long about his visit to Hiroshima.
Ambassador Lim, I think you wanted to comment on this.
Before answering this question about the CPP, Korea has not joined the TPP yet. We have had a policy of concentrating on the bilateral free trade agreement for a long while, but still we are open to joining the TPP, and I'm sure that we are going to have a public hearing first, and after that, I don't know, but I'm very optimistic about Korea's joining in other countries in becoming a member of the TPP. And about that, the Canada's soft power and Canada's leadership in advancing the women in empowerment and human rights issues. My just general suggestion is sometimes those issues have very complex and sensitive environment, and when we address that issue, we already think about in what context and in which venue will be the best mechanism to address those issues. And even when we talk about Indo-Pacific strategies, this is basically regional strategy, but we also have a bilateral setting and regional setting and global setting. And when we address those issues, where the very good combination of these bilateral, regional, and global diplomacy can produce maybe the best result. The very generous, the general answer to that question. Okay.
Ambassador Maria.
Canada has made a name for itself in championing universal human rights, women's rights, and many other such issues, and that is an intrinsic part of Canada's soft power. However, there is no, while there are generally accepted human rights rules, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's always a context. So we have highly appreciated the statement of Foreign Minister Julie at the Economic Club in Toronto last month, where she said that Canada will have a pragmatic approach. And we take this as having a broader understanding of the context upon which these values operate. We all subscribe to the same values, but operationally, it may look different.
I think that's an excellent point, that there's got to be, the complexity of it is because it comes from context, right? So, okay, let's go on to this question. Do you think that people in your regions are actually noticing Canada's new engagement strategy, both federal and provincial? So do they notice the increased federal and provincial presence in your respective jurisdictions?
May I
Maria?
go first? A big yes for the Philippines. A lot has been happening in the relations over the past year. And I would say that the implementation of the Indo-Pacific Strategy, while a regional strategy, has done great things for the bilateral relations. I can make a whole speech about all the many things that has developed in the past year, but I would credit a lot of that to the Indo-Pacific Strategy.
Others? Ambassador Lim?
Well, we were very lucky to have the visit of Prime Minister Trudeau in May this year, and Minister Jolie, she had visited Seoul 3 times for the last 1 year. And the personal engagement at the top leadership really raised the profile of Canada in Korea. And also Prime Minister Trudeau, he delivered a speech at our National Assembly, and that was a very good video coverage about it. But still, we need to do more to promote our Indo-Pacific strategies, since I just got a copy of the resolution adopted by our National Assembly to commemorate the 60th anniversary of Korea-Canada diplomatic ties, and the Indo-Pacific strategy is missing in that resolution. So I felt that we need to do more to raise the profile of our Indo-Pacific the partnership.
May I ask this question? I mean, did the subject matter of, we've got somebody from LNG Canada who's part of our audience, and you'll recall, Ambassador, that when your Prime Minister Kishida, was here in February of this year, it was...
No, January.
It was in January? Okay, January, which followed the visit by Chancellor Scholz from Germany, asking for LNG, both leaders asking for LNG. Ambassador Lim, did the subject matter of LNG come up in the discussions when Minister Joly was there or when the Prime Minister was there?
I don't remember every detail of the readout of the meetings, but LNG Canada is a big topic for us. And as you know, the Korean Gas Corporation, they are member of the consortium which was formed in 2011. And in 2025, the first installment of LNG will be transported to the region. And we are now working on the phase 2 of the LNG Canada. And that is one of the, I think, one of the issues in our government consultations. But we have, as of now, the other issues like hydrogen, SMR, and also the electric vehicle batteries. So we have a bunch of issues in our basket now.
High Commissioner, did you want to comment on energy issues in the region?
Well, Australia is a long-term energy supplier to the region, and investment from our customers, Japan, Korea and others, has underpinned an enormous economic expansion of that sector in Australia. And it's an objective of the Australian government to ensure that we are a long-term stable supplier of energy, conscious that that is a particularly important ingredient to stability in the region.
So is there a model that Australia is using that Canada should be thinking about in terms of taking advantage of those same kinds of opportunities?
Look, I'm not an expert in energy, to be honest. So I'd hesitate to provide advice to someone else on projects that run into the tens of billions of dollars. But you know, over the last 25 years, particularly what's happened on the Northwest Shelf with gas and the long-term expansion of that particular opportunity that saw us become the world's largest LNG exporter at some points last year, it's underpinned by incredibly long-term investment partnerships and customer supply arrangements. Conscious that there are domestic requirements around climate change and emissions, but that, you know, we all find our way in countries like ours to deal with those. So I don't know if there's lessons, because in many ways our economic structures are very similar. You know, we're both advanced economies with advanced finance sectors with long-term partners in the energy export space. We are somewhat more isolated, so we've had to do more of it on our own. And as I understand, a lot of the Canadian energy exports flow through your neighbour because they also have infrastructure. It's not an option we have.
Yamanouchi-san.
Yes, this LNG Canada is one of the most important topics in terms of the energy security, because we are living in the global warming. So we have to address to the global green economy, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we have enough energies. And this two combination makes Canada more significant. And LNG Canada is one of the biggest private investment projects in this country. And I'm very proud that Mitsubishi is part of it. And I'll tell you, I want to share one thing. In order to make this happen, Mitsubishi made 12,000 individual town hall meetings with indigenous people to get support and understanding. It's a very serious commitment. And this is a very important energy source towards the 2050. But at the same time, LNG Canada is one of those lists of the energy sources which Canada can offer. So Ambassador Lim just mentioned SMR, hydrogen, and also ammonia, and many other sort of choices. And the CCS is also one of the most important elements for this net zero for 2050. So I think Canada has enormous sort of a set list to offer to us. But LNG Canada is currently very, very important. If everything goes well, by the end of next year, and first cargo will go to Asia.
So you talked about really a business case that LNG Canada has to evaluate for itself to decide whether to go forward. Do you get a sense that there's already a business case for the LNG Canada 2, Phase 2?
That's a very specific question, but I think there are those people who are engaged with LNG Canada Phase 1, seeing the future of Phase 2, of course.
Ambassador Lim?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, and Korea is one of the largest importer of LNG, maybe along with Japan and China, and LNG accounts for like 27% of the total energy consumption in Korean market. And I once did a calculus about how impactful the LNG Canada will make in the Korean LNG market. And with the current expected amount going to Korea, maybe going to region from 2025, it's not that much. So still, we need to do more in importing LNG from Canada, since there are so many advantages in LNG Canada project. First, there is no geopolitical risk. And as people said, the cooler climate, meaning that the less the greenhouse gas emission than developing in other regions. So the Korean Gas Corporation, they want to start the phase 2. They definitely have a big interest in starting another big project in the coming years.
So one of the challenges for LNG Canada Phase 2 is that they want it to be net zero, which they're able to do with LNG Canada Phase 1, because all of the electricity to run the operation will come from the Site C hydro facility in British Columbia. Every electron from that Site C dam will go into LNG 1, but there will be an issue as to how you get enough electricity to run LNG Phase 2 with the same criteria. But maybe a question I'd ask is this: would governments that are taking LNG to displace the use of coal in Japan or in South Korea, would they be prepared to acknowledge the GHG emission reductions so that the Canadian government or the British Columbia government can say, yes, we are reducing the GHG emissions into the atmosphere, the global atmosphere, because there's no such thing as a Canadian atmosphere? Would governments be willing to acknowledge the accounting for lower GHG emissions from the use of natural gas?
Gary-san, we discussed this before, and
I wanted everybody else to hear it, though.
Yeah. So this is a matter of the Canadian domestic regulation and also the capping for each provinces. And there's also a political argument that Canadian export of energy will help the actual reduction of the GHG globally. So this is more like a half political discussion in this country and half business deals.
Yeah.
But the first thing first, we have to make sure that phase 1 of LNG Canada will be completed and export will start. Then we think hard for that. But at the same time, and I think Canada has enormous opportunities and abilities and potentials for ammonia and hydrogen, and also a small module reactor. And so the energy security, in terms of the energy security, Canada can play a big role.
Ambassador Lim?
I'm expecting that our discussion evolving into the discussion on the transfer of greenhouse gas emission credit under the Paris Agreement, but we have not reached that stage for consulting that issue. So the point is, well, the Korea has a plan of phasing out the coal plants, and for the midterm goal, we need to replace coal with the LNG, importing from Canada and other countries. Then the amount of greenhouse gas reduction, that credit, should be transported, the transport to Canada. Well, I know that that is an issue in your politics, but we have not reached that consultation yet.
Very good. Here's another question that comes from the audience, and I confess to all of you that I don't have proficiency in this subject matter, so I can't give you any context for this question. But the question is, what are the ambassadors expecting or looking for from a defense policy update? I'm sorry, I can't give you any more detail than that.
I'll be frank, it's not something one talks about in public about one's partners and friends. You know, I mean, it's a domestic policy decision and product of domestic discussions and resource allocation of Canada, to be honest. But I think it's worth emphasising the amount of work that we do. You know, there have been the naval operations in the Asia area, some reported recently. There's ongoing work on things like cybersecurity that don't fall into what I'll call the defence part, but are very important contributors to security overall, of which defence is a particular part. And so the continuance of the ability and the intention, for which I've never heard a question about, continuing work with friends, partners and allies, that's never under question. So I think people are looking to continue that. But as for other things, and I take the question is looking at essentially resources, that's a matter for Canadian domestic systems and politics to determine as a free liberal democracy.
Ambassador Lim?
Well, Seoul is very much looking forward to see your defense policy update. And we have just launched 2+2 ministerial meeting involving foreign and defense ministers with the United Kingdom. And that is such the third such kind of dialogue format after the United States and Australia and now United Kingdom. And my colleagues in Seoul, why not with Canada? So we are very much interested in launching like the defense foreign policy partnership involving foreign ministry and defense ministries. And also we believe that there must be ample rooms for cooperation, not just in defense cooperation, but also in defense industry cooperation.
Very good. So
If I may.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, so I think two elements. One is personnel. General Air repeatedly mentioned that the shortage of the personnel, human resources of Canadian military. It's very, very serious matters. So first, the personnel have to be fulfilled. The second, military assets. So then fish, that means ship, and also the transportations, and also air. So there are so many sort of assets which should be needed. And I have one example from myself. I said, go to the place and visiting the area. Then actually last June, I had the pleasure to visit Northern Territories. Then I saw the vast land in Arctic areas. The Arctic area is becoming a very, very dangerous spot. Because as you know, that the Chinese and Russians are sort of enhancing the activities there. So Canada have to address those reality. Then I think the military defense update is necessary and it's indispensable.
Yes, Ambassador Maria.
Just quickly, there has been an increase in defense exchanges between the Philippines and Canada over the past year, and we would like to see this increased engagement and interaction reflected in the defense policy update.
Very good. Ambassador Yamanouchi, you've been to Cambridge Bay, you've been to, you've been as far north as Resolute, right? Which is 74 degrees north latitude. Just out of curiosity of the people in the room, raise your hand if you've been north of 60. Oh, quite a few. Okay, so you are among the few Canadians that have seen this magnificent part of the country. And I lived there back in the early 1980s. I lived in a tent for 4 months. And it was an extraordinary time to to visit the North, and it's a beautiful part of the country. I do worry about whether sovereignty of the Arctic is in jeopardy, and so I just throw that out. So we've got roughly 10 minutes left, and so there's 5 of you. You get 2 minutes to answer the following question, each of you. It's a big one. What are the 3 issues, one imminent, one long-term, and one long-term, that you think Canadian stakeholders will encounter in your region? Okay, Maria.
Okay,
Okay, imminent would be expectations. And the question as to whether Canada is in the region for the long run. So there would be issues on whether what Canada doing is sustainable,
Yep.
pragmatic, realistic. That would be the first challenge. The second would be, in the midterm, the growing tension between powers in the region. What countries in the region, like and ASEAN in particular, do not want to do is to be pawns in big power rivalry, and I'm sure Canada doesn't want to be the same. So it has often been alluded to that the things we are doing because some other power put us up to it. So that is always a particular challenge that Canada, like the Philippines and ASEAN, would be up against. And the third, for long term, would be the impact of climate change, environmental degradation. It's very difficult to promote economic growth and development in Asia, while at the same time being mindful of the long-term effects of climate change and environmental degradation.
Excellent answer. Scott.
I won't take the 2 minutes. I think the first one, the imminent, it's the rollout. The announcement's hard, but the rollout's harder. I know officials have been working very hard on how do we put this into practice on the ground in a way that we can demonstrate value so that the resources stay there, which leads into my second point, which is just the changing environment. So personnel, officials move on, politicians move on in both countries, in different parts of the world, in foundations. So maintaining the effort through changing personnel in particular and the changing environment, that's a medium-term issue because that can happen very rapidly, and I think more rapidly than it used to. Thirdly, I just say stamina. Stamina in the constant contest for resources within governments. That is going to be increasingly a challenge in all our countries because fighting for, maintaining, delivering on those resources is difficult. There's always more people putting their hand up for resources inside government than there are resources. So you've always got to constantly win that. Stamina in terms of, as personnel change, the ideas being carried over, the handovers being undertaken, because as others, I wouldn't have used the term Jeff used myself, only maybe because I'm a diplomat, but, you know, the ministers here have spoken about the need for a long-term presence, the need to demonstrate the commitment, and so that's going to require stamina.
Ambassador Lim.
The first litmus test for the Canadian government and other stakeholders in demonstrating how serious you are in engaging with the Indo-Pacific region will be your G7 presidency in 2025. Not only just the G7 summit meeting, there will be G7 ministerial meetings and the P7, the meetings among the business leaders, and there is even U7, the meeting of university presidents among G7 countries. But usually you invite like the guest countries to the G7. But Canada usually had invited many countries from Africa and from South America. And also the venue of the place, you have a very symbolic significance. Where you usually had the G7 meeting in Ontario and in Quebec. So that is the very good opportunity for Canadian government and other stakeholders to show the Asian friends how serious you are. Okay.
Very good. Yamanouchi-san, the final word goes to you.
all the great answers were given from the three ambassadors, two ambassadors and high commissioners. But I kind of echo it. For a short term, I think Canada has to build up its reputation, trust, and influence over Asia. You said many things, but you have to realize what you said. I think that is very important thing. The midterm, I think the uncertainty of geopolitics in Asia. So Canada showing its willingness to address that. For that purposes, you have to have set of the policies and resources and commitment, I think, including the defense upgrade. I think that is the second one. Third term, I echo you. This global warming, this is a very serious matter. Canada has so many things to offer to us, so we expect that.
Okay, well, look, I've never been a speaker of a legislature, but I do watch the time, and we still have 2 minutes. So I'm going to use my discretion to ask you this one final question, and it's a yes or no answer. Okay? So my question for each of you is, are you optimistic that Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy can result in something great for Canada and the Indo-Pacific region? We'll start with you, Yamanouchi-san. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes, and
Okay.
as you know, Gary, I have been a speaker, and this is a much more well-behaved audience.
So look, I make this observation for all of you through my 22 years of government service. Pessimists are often right. Optimists are often wrong. But everything good that happens is because an optimist tried to do something. So I'm appreciative that our four ambassadors are optimistic about being able to move forward on something that's good for Canada and good for the Indo-Pacific region. And I thank each and every one of you for participating today. And I thank you, the audience, for participating with your questions and being engaged today. And we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning as well. So thank you. Help me thank our panel.